So delightful to be here with Rabbi Dr. Ariel Burger, who's someone I've admired for a long time, his work and the presence he brings into the world. And he is touring around the country right now based upon this new book he just published called Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom, which I enjoyed very much. So thanks for taking a little time to talk.
The pleasure. So great to be with you.
So, toward an ethic of interpretation. I know this is something you think about. I believe you've also been a guest lecturer at Boston University on this topic. What's the issue you're responding to? What's the problem that we have to respond to here?
So, Elie Wiesel once described sacred text as theological plutonium, meaning that when you have a text with millions of believers who will decide the trajectory of their lives and make ethical decisions on that basis that can affect millions more people, you have to be very careful about the way that text is interpreted. We know that there are difficult texts in our tradition, in the Bible, in Chumash, in Tanakh, in other religious literature as well. And so the question arises, how do we find an ethic of interpretation that does justice to the text, has fidelity to the text, isn't just sort of explaining the text away or ignoring it when we don't like it, but also that responds to the demands of conscience. And this came to life for me when I was in Elie Wiesel's classroom. We were studying the book of Genesis on one day of the week, and on the next day we were studying different texts related to situations of oppression in the world. And we studied Philip Gorevich's book on Rwanda, and he tracks the presence, the subtle but insidious presence of the Hamitic myth, which is the story of Noah cursing his grandson to be a slave of slaves after Noah got drunk and his son Ham did something happen. He saw him naked or something worse happen. It's not clear exactly from the text. And Noah curses his grandson to be a slave of slaves, and that led to centuries of this idea that people of color are meant to be slaves. This was used to justify slavery in this country. There was a preacher named Samuel Howe. You can read his sermon in the Deep South in defense of slavery, and he's quoting our Torah. So I came to this and I was like shattering. Like, how could it be that our Torah, and Gorevich relates to the Rwandan genocide because there was a Belgian missionary who brought this thinking to a radio show that he hosted in Rwanda that indirectly but significantly led to the genocide. So how could it be that our Torah can cause such harm or can lead even indirectly to genocide? It was something that kept me up at night for a long time. And in talking to Professor Wiesel about it and looking into it, I started to develop this question of how do we develop an ethic of interpretation?
Yeah. You know, I was recently in a shul, and the rabbi said to me, I'm horrified to the day, he said, you know, the jihadists are right. I said, what? He said, the jihadists are right. If God tells you to kill the masses, even if they're innocent, you do it because it's all about submission. The only thing they're wrong about is that God didn't actually tell them that. And I was so blown away by this. And I feel like the two fundamental approaches we see today is either kind of a fundamentalistic literalism to a text, divine submission to whatever the text says or you've been told it says, or this other extreme of the text is irrelevant, it's backwards, It's archaic, it has no weight or moral value to it. This middle ground, what would be an example of a text that you think you would find problematic or that many do? And what it would look like to bring a new ethic of interpretation to it.
Yeah, so first of all, I can say, not knowing the rabbi you're talking about, but and I say this advisedly, but that position to me smacks of, and I say this about almost nothing, but it smacks of heresy, because it denies the presence of an oral tradition, which is one of the classic definitions of heresy in Judaism. Right? We believe in a written Torah and an oral Torah, and it's the interplay of the two that leads to the growth and evolution of Torah in the way that God wants. So that's the first thing I want to say. Again, advisedly. I don't like using that word, but I think it's accurate here. And what you're describing as the two extreme positions of fundamentalism or rendering the whole tradition irrelevant, that is exactly the point. I mean, to me, this ethic of interpretation, which is really also synonymous with midrash, which we'll talk about, is the third way. It's the third way of dealing with and holding the tension between what the text says and the demands of conscience. So a text, probably the most famous text in this regard is the Ben Sora Amore, which is the biblical commandment that when a couple has a child, a son, who is gluttonous, doesn't listen to his parents, they should take him to the Beit Din and he's stoned to death. So if we were going to stop this conversation right here, that would be sort of a bad commercial for Judaism, Torah, ethics, humanity.
Which is also a reminder that we shouldn't look at other traditions' texts and just pull something out of it as if it represents their...
Right.
Right.
Selective reading often leads to bad commercials.
Right.
Fortunately, we have an oral tradition that works very hard to do what I'm describing as an ethic of interpretation. It doesn't say, we don't like that text, we're going to ignore it. It doesn't say, this is offensive to us, and therefore it's irrelevant, and it's time to let go of the Torah and create a new kind of tradition or a new sacred text. But it also doesn't say, okay, let's go implement this text. The rabbis had a different approach, which was to say, first to go through a series of interpretive moves using the traditional methodologies of interpretation, which are defined by the rabbis. The Shlosh Lemidos of Rabbi Shmuly. We know that there are different lists of the methods of interpreting that are given a mandate by the rabbis as part of the process of interpreting, and they use those rules. They're playing according to the rules of the game. They're not using any other rules. And so they say, for example, the verse says the boy doesn't listen to the voice of his mother or his father. The father and mother have to have identical voices. And if they don't, then this law doesn't apply. So now they've narrowed the law significantly. Then they go from there and say, well, not only is it the voices, but they have to look similar, or they have to have a similar height. And they keep going, until in the end, the rabbis conclude, Ben Sora Mora never happened and never will happen. So there are a couple of things to notice here.
Yeah.
One is their every specific move is legitimate from the standpoint of the tradition.
Right.
Number two, there's a question we can ask in progressive or modern Orthodox circles for decades. It's been stated that where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. I think Blue Greenberg coined that term, right? That phrase. When there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. And some people even within the modern Orthodox camp feel that there has to be some place where there's not a way. Rav Soloveitchik talked about this as a kind of heroism. He used different examples of dealing with Kohanim, places where they're very difficult halachot in application, where a Kohen can't marry the person he wants to marry, she can't marry him because of Allah. And Rav Soloveitchik talked about it as a kind of heroism, a kind of sacrifice, an ethic of sacrifice. So let's say that there's a place where this process breaks down, where we're not able to solve the problems. Those are the places where we really run into trouble. We really start to wrestle with things. But there's a lot of territory before those places where there is a way forward, and our community is often not willing to use it. So this is an example where the rabbis were saying, this is clearly not going to work. We're not going to take, disobedient children out to be stoned to death. And they found a way to move forward without erasing the passages or stepping outside in methodological terms from the traditional midrashic approach. The question is, did they have that in mind from the beginning, or are they actually following the breadcrumbs of midrash, and they would have maybe reluctantly accepted a different conclusion?
Yeah.
So that question is often a question that splits the Jewish community, even the modern Orthodox community. My intuition on this is just my intuition is that they knew that this halacha cannot be implemented from the beginning, and that's actually what's meant by the last line of this text that's often quoted, is why is it there? Why is it there? Why is it in the Torah? If it's not meant to be implemented, and it says drosh v'kabel schar. So I want to talk more about that, but I think drosh v'kabel schar means seek and receive reward. Seek and receive reward. On the face of it, sounds like sort of a weak justification for a problematic text. We're putting it in here so that you can wrestle with it and get the reward of learning it. Okay, but why doesn't the Torah have other things that are unconscionable? Why don't we have 6 books of the Torah, and the 6th book could just be terrible, unconscionable, yucky things, and then we'll get a lot of schar. So it has to be more than that, and that's one of the mysterious things about the text. So we can talk more about that, but that's where I think the rabbis are going.
Beautiful. So you touched upon this. I don't know that I believe in this, psychologically believe in this agendaless interpretive journey. I mean, I think prior to Kant, we thought there was sort of objective data and we could access that, But then we started to realize in modernity that all objective data passes through the subjectivity of our minds, this filter. And so there is not an ability to not bring one's own self and consciousness into the text. And so I guess my question for you is, where does the self end and the text begin? Where in this mental space, in this spiritual space, is there a gap or a choice? Because it feels like the text kind of gets absorbed into the psyche and then sort of played with and filtered and then kind of gets released to some degree.
Right.
So where does that interpretive process take place, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
There are three things that come to mind. The first is, a lot of this starts with Abraham arguing with God on behalf of Sarah, right?
Yeah.
And the amazing thing about that text always to me is that God speaks first and says, "Hamechaseh ani me Abraham," right? Am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm about to do to Sodom? And who's God talking to in that pasuk? So my understanding is God is talking to God. Well, you can say Malachim, you can say God's self.
Yeah.
I think God is turning to the camera and talking to us.
Oh, okay.
I think God is saying to us,
Right.
to you, the reader,
Right.
am I going to hide from Abraham?
Oh, that's good.
I
Yeah.
am, and God
That's
is
good.
God is winking and
Right.
saying, I'm letting you in on the fact that I need Abraham to step up and argue with me here, and that will be an expression of my will.
Oh, very nice, yeah.
In a way that submission will be the opposite, right? So that's where a lot of this starts. That's where the biblical mandate, perhaps, to be engaged in this kind of midrashic pushback, or other kinds of pushback. Abraham argues with God, Moshe argues with God, Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev much later argues with God, Elie Wiesel argued with God his whole life. I think there's a place in Judaism for that, and I think that's a part of this story. Number two, your question is really important, especially because we know that one of the ideals is to become a living, breathing Sefer Torah. In the Gemara it says, how foolish are these people who they stand up Mikami Sefer D'Oraisa, but not before Sober Merabbanan. They stand up for a Sefer Torah, but not before a student of the Torah, a Talmid Chacham, or a Rav, a teacher, a living embodiment. And the Kal V'chomer there, the logic is, if you're standing up for the object of Torah, then of course you should stand up for the subject of Torah, someone who's incorporated Torah into her life or his life and lives it.
Yeah.
Right? It's obvious.
Right.
So
I remember there's a posek we both know well, but wouldn't want to be quoted on this, that he told me he no longer, frequently doesn't look into a sefer for a halachic shaila if it's on the spot, because he felt that he trusts his intuition because he lives a life of Torah. Now, he wasn't saying this in a gaivatic way, an arrogant kind of way, but his belief in himself that he is so committed to learning and being one with sort of Ratzon Hashem, with the will of God, that there can be a trust, there could be a betachon ultimately in following a sort of moral intuition. Right?
I mean, I would have a very hard time saying that about myself.
Yeah.
But I could see saying it about certain other people.
Well, you wouldn't say it in that way, but you would find a place to talk about listening to your moral conscience.
Absolutely, and that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
So the question is, where does that happen, and what are the limits, and what are the lines?
Right.
So Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, a great Hasidic teacher from Poland, a lot to say about him, but he said the Torah is a commentary on the world is a commentary on the Torah. There's another quote, I think also from him, although I'm not sure, the Torah is a commentary on the soul, and the soul is a commentary on the Torah. And so the question of the interface, the interaction of Torah and self is very important, and I think not clear. I don't think it's possible to delineate in absolute terms and say that my life is not Torah, my life is somehow secular or outside. My life is Torah too. My life is a language. Rabbi Nachman talks about this a lot, that the experiences that I have are rimazim. They're hints from the one, from the Creator, of how to grow, how to come close to that oneness. And so everything that I experience is somehow a language. In the same way that is a funny example, in the same way that I was teaching my son to drive over the last year or so, and one of the first things I said to him was, driving is a language. It's not just a technical series of movements. It's also when you're at a four-way stop sign, you're reading the other drivers.
Yes,
you're sending signals. If you inch forward, you're sending a signal.
Right.
You're saying, I'm going to go, I'm going to go, I'm going to go. Or you're saying, I'm fine to wait, I'm patient.
Right.
and many, many more things like that in how you comport yourself.
Yeah.
And not just in a car, but in the vehicle of your life also. So I think it's hard to differentiate. I think the distinction I would make more, rather than between Torah and not Torah, is the distinction between reflective and unreflective, examined and unexamined aspects of myself. In other words, the parts of myself that I haven't yet discovered, or if I suddenly encounter something in myself and I realize, oh, I have this issue, I hadn't named it quite before in this way. Now I need to bring that into the processing machinery, so to speak, of my spiritual practice. And if I can learn about it, and if I can pray about it, and I can meditate upon it, and have conversation with friends about these kinds of issues, then it becomes examined, and it becomes more likely to be aligned with Torah values, as opposed to something that I haven't really thought about before. But here's the real rub, and I think what the rabbis are so invested in is that it works in both directions. So if I had to say the whole thing in like a sentence, it would be, when you encounter a difficult, troubling, unconscionable text in your sacred tradition, whatever tradition you're coming from, the rabbinic approach, the midrashic approach to that is to say, pause there, stay there, you're going to hang out there for a while, you're going to allow the text to challenge your intuitions. You have to have that conversation and say, maybe there's a place for me to reevaluate my moral intuition. Maybe I'm influenced by other values, liberal, conservative, whatever other values in the culture, and I need to allow myself to question that. And I need to allow my conscience, once I've clarified it to the best of my ability, that this moral intuition is real. It's a moral intuition. It's not coming from watching too much TV or just the influence of my parents, but there's something bedrock that feels to me like moral intuition. I need to then question the text and see, is there a way to move the text? Is there a way to find a source or a way of interpreting the source that will move the text closer and bridge the gap or lessen the gap? Maybe not entirely, but even a micro step is significant. And it's a two-way process. The text is challenging me, and I'm challenging the text. And we need both of those things. And I think the two extreme positions you were talking about before are people letting go of one or the other. I'm never going to challenge the text. I'm going to be a fundamentalist. Or I'm only going to challenge the text, and I'm going to totally accept my moral intuition at face value. That's a more progressive, liberal, Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. And we need to kind of allow both of those processes to happen.
So I remember Rabbi Saul Berman quoting a Reb Sadia Gaon, which I never saw inside, that basically said, if your sense of reason, your ethics and your intuition are clashing with what you understand the text to say, you have to just go back and forth between the two. And either you're misinterpreting the text, or you're not coming from the right place. You have to tweak your reason, your understanding, and do that work. Do that work, not to be lazy. So if you could pick one of these three examples, three issues that folks think a lot about today, to kind of like guide someone into how they would address it. Here, moving from Tanakh to Halakha, an interpretive Halakha. Either one who is troubled by how we understand Halakha for the LGBTQ community, or in terms of feminism, egalitarianism, or in terms of the land for peace kind of things. I'm not asking you to resolve those issues, but how would you guide someone to begin that journey? Because I think what people often do who are in that tension is they wait to find a source that basically says what they want to say, as opposed to sort of engaging an ethic of interpretation within sort of the bulk of sources.
Right.
So in any of those three examples, if you're willing, how would you guide someone to kind of begin that process of how to bring their self and what's so clear to them to that difficult halachic reality they encounter?
So just to restate, an ethic of interpretation has two elements together. One is fidelity to the text. I don't want to misinterpret. I don't want to deliberately misinterpret. I don't want to be selective. And I don't want to misrepresent. I want to be very clear about what the text says and what the commentators say and what the text has been understood to be saying for thousands of years. And I also want to be very, very connected to the sense of implications of what this interpretation will do. What kind of world will it create? Is sort of a Kantian approach, a categorical approach of, well, if we took this teaching or this halakha and we designed the world on the basis of this one halakha, what kind of world would we see? And sometimes you don't even need to go that far to see that we would run into major problems and issues. So I think of a conversation I had with a colleague at a conference a year and a half ago, I think, and he's active in LGBTQ activism in all kinds of ways. And he said something along the lines of wrestling with the difficult texts in Leviticus about this issue. That was like so 90s. Like at this point, we just have to move on from the text. And my heart broke a little bit to hear that. And I challenged him on it because for me, that's letting go of fidelity to the text, right? That's saying, I can't handle it anymore. The tension is too great. I'm going to leave the text behind. And we're going to move on, recognizing that there's a text we don't accept. In some congregations, in some liberal congregations, they don't read that verse when they come to that parsha in the Torah reading. And I've seen that skipped. And once you start skipping, there are a lot of things. You know, if I were going to skip, I would skip a lot of things, perhaps. But that feels like an abdication of responsibility, not because I wanted my friend to stay within the kind of frum boundaries in some way, or this is someone who's not observant in a traditional sense, but because we're losing the contribution that he and others can make in expanding Yagdil Torah V'Yadir and expanding the palace of Torah. We're losing. That's why my heart broke, because there have been attempts, Steve Greenberg and others, and some really formidable attempts, and some attempts that I found lacking because either they were too close and not willing to push hard enough on reevaluating, reinterpreting, or because they went so quickly to reevaluation and reinterpretation that they let go of fidelity, and others that did an okay job with the text and the methodology and the technical part of it, but weren't really thinking about the lived experience of people who are struggling with the text. So then the question to me is, what would I say to someone to get them to a place where they can where they're more likely to stay in this tension? I think that's the thing. It's a tension. So what do we do when we encounter tension, and how do we manage that? And then it becomes a conversation not about halakha and technique and technical methodological questions. Then it becomes a question about cultivating the character traits and the inner faculties and capacities that I need to manage tension, creative, holy tension. I'm not saying we should choose tension for the sake of choosing tension, although some people think that is the Jewish way, and I've done that at times in my life. That's not what I'm talking about. But there are places where that this tension is holy. I don't want to resolve it prematurely. To resolve it prematurely is a temptation. It's an abdication, and the Jewish evolutionary process won't benefit from my wrestling, and I might also miss out on some wisdom here. So what do you need to do then to cultivate tension? It's resilience, it's empathy, a lot of self-care. It's not doing it in isolation. It's building community around this. At least having a chavrut, having one other person you can really hold that tension together and say, listen, I'm dealing with this. There's this place in the Torah that drives me crazy. I can't stand it. I also don't feel ready to let go of it. Can we be in conversation about it and learn it together? But not just learn it, but also talk about the emotional, psychological process of encountering those places.
Beautiful. So, and I think of this, so much of our avoda, so much of our service of God can be besimcha, can be in a joyful place. And it's so powerful to find those challenging places and have that be the avoda, also that place of tension, and feel like just existing in it is a service, it's a worship, it's like a relationship.
Beautifully said. And it's one of the reasons we need simcha. To help us, we need joy
to hold
these hard places.
Because
the world is broken. We need to cultivate joy so that we can be with the world in its brokenness and not run away screaming.
And to understand how much space we need from that tension, and where, when and how we can be in it, maybe even. So my last question for you, and I think we're moving exactly towards that now, is what are some of the other classical midot that would be important to hold and to cultivate in this process of cultivating an ethic of interpretation?
So I think savlanut is one of them, certainly. Savlanut means the ability to tolerate difficulty. It also means the ability to carry a heavy burden. And we have to think about the individual and the collective lower backs of our people and all people, and how much are people carrying? So the trait of savlanut is building core strength, spiritual, emotional core strength, to be able to stay in those places of difficulty without collapsing or without doing damage to ourselves. And that's one of them, but there's another which is equally important, which is a kind of meta character trait, meta midah, which is reflectivity, or the capacity to reflect and see, where am I holding right now? What capacity do I have? When you go to the gym, you think about, what should I be lifting?
Yeah.
Right? You don't just jump to 300 pounds.
Right.
You ask.
Right.
Maybe with a trainer, you think about what's right for me to push. I want micro tears. I want to grow, but I don't want to destroy myself.
Yeah.
So figuring out exactly where that is, what challenges am I able to take on right now? Now the problem is, life doesn't wait for us to figure out what challenges to take on. And when we encounter places in Torah that are difficult, it's often because we have a personal stake in it. It's part of our personal story, our personal journey in some way. Like for my friend, the question that he was asking about Leviticus was a very personal question, as well as a communal leadership question. And that's the way it should be. Paul Tillich said all theology is biography. Our leadership emerges from our personal story. So it's not so much choosing this issue or that issue, because I think those questions are determined by the story in the course of our lives.
Yeah.
It's determining, while I'm engaged with this issue, how assiduous, how often, how frequently am I engaging in this process? Maybe Shabbat is a time to relax and not think about it. Maybe Shabbat is dafka, a time that I have the inner resources to think about it. You have to ask yourself those questions. Who helps me feel safe and strong enough to tackle these issues? And can I spend more time with those people and build community around that? Those are the kinds of reflective questions I think that are really important. And of course, anava, humility, in both directions. Rabbi Nachman says we need humility. Obviously, we need humility before people who are greater than us. We need humility before people who are like us, and people who are even before ourselves. He says you need humility before yourself. So there's a kind of humility before the text. We don't take, as Jews traditionally, we don't take changes to the text or reinterpretation, radical interpretations lightly. But I think we also have to have anava, humility, before the people whose lives are affected by our interpretations, and feel that we're responsible for them too. There were many great legal decisors, poskim, who would not make a decision without being in the presence of the person. They wouldn't make a psak on the phone. Now, part of that is just because you want to see the person in his or her totality. You have information that comes through about their economic well-being in a way that could affect the decision. But I think it's also because we care about harat and hadrat panim. We care about the illumination of the face, the eye-to-eye, face-to-face encounter allows you to see the person as real and a deeply meaningful reality that we don't bow in Judaism, but an inner sense of reverence for that, as well as an inner sense of reverence for the text. And if I can have those two together and the humility that comes with that, I'll be in good shape. There's one other thing I want to say, because I didn't come back to the drosh v'kabel schar. It's possible, this is just a thought, that the rabbis are saying drosh v'kabel schar in a much bigger way than just, as I said before, read this difficult text and you'll get the reward of learning Torah. It could be that they're giving us a hint, a much bigger hint, which is drosh, which is the same word as midrash, means to seek, to reinterpret, to seek interpretation, to seek more understanding. When you engage in a non-passive but active relationship with the text, as opposed to what the rabbi you quoted said, which is submission. When you engage, you're active, you're willing to argue with God in the same language that God is asking us to use, which is the language of traditional midrash or interpretation. When you do that active work of drosh, then you enter the world of schar, as opposed to the world. What's the opposite of the world of schar? It's the world of what the Zohar calls nama de kisufin. It's the world where the bread of shame, where everything is given to you for free and you don't earn it. In other words, there was a world that God created early on, according to the Zohar and Kabbalah, that was a world of nama de kisufin, that everything was given to us. And in some sense, the generations before the giving of the Torah are seen that way. The world was sustained by God's loving kindness. We didn't earn it. But after the Torah was given, we're in a world where we get to earn and own our lives and the world and our experience. And so you only enter into that world of schar and experience and being a person of choice when you're willing to say, I'm in a conversation with God. God wants me to be in conversation, not just passive recipient, but it's a chavruta in some sense, with all the awe
Yeah.
and all the reverence and all the danger
Yeah.
and all the potential for arrogance that can come with that.
Right.
That's why we need the humility, but to know that we are expected, that God is turning to the reader, to us, and saying, I'm waiting for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm waiting for you to surprise me with an argument, so to speak. I'm waiting for you to come with a new interpretation.
Right. Love it.
Give me a new interpretation
Yeah,
so that the world can look more like the way that I've already told you I want the world to
Right,
look, which is a
right.
world of chesed,
Yeah.
a world of loving
Beautiful.
kindness.
With the Torah's Chaim that's alive in the world.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
beautiful. And I know you'll appreciate, as a teacher of Rabbi Nachman, the value here of hitbodedut, of being able to sit in a space of solitude and isolation, because given today's reality, as we said, it can be quite lonely for those who don't feel the fidelity to the text or don't feel this other moral imperative. Yeah. And so to have chaverim and rabbis, as you said, and to be able to sit with the Ribbono Shel Olam in that presence and feel kind of held and not totally alone in this.
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And hitbodedut is the primary way that I was taught to work on cultivating the sense of moral intuition. How do I know if it's a real moral intuition or not? Is it, the Meshilach talks about mizukak shivatayim, it has to be clarified 7 times. You have to go through a real process. That's a metaphor for real process of clarification, which can happen in hitbodedut and starts there. That's how I was taught. Also happens in sichot chaverim, in conversations with friends, and also happens in community and with teachers especially. So I think that's really critical, because otherwise, I'm walking around with an unexamined or not fully clarified set of beliefs or values, and it's exactly in these moments of encounter with difficult texts that there's an opportunity, there's a call to arms or a call to action for me to clarify my own intuition. But again, the Torah itself, I think, is waiting for us to expand the Torah, to expand the palace of Torah through that back and forth process.
Read Tamar Ross's book, Expanding the Palace of Torah. So check out Witness, lessons from Elie Wiesel's classroom, and invite Rabbi Dr. Ariel Burger to your community. Master teacher for a limited time is actually traveling and engaging with communities around the country. And check out arielburger.com to learn more about him and the work he's doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.